Travel with me into the twilight of forgotten lives, where the edges of history blur into something softer than memory and older than the stories we tell to comfort ourselves. In this hour, when the world grows quiet and the lamps of the day surrender to the gentler glow of evening, let us walk together into a landscape where the past is not dead, but lies breathing beneath the layers of dust and silence. The South of another century rises slowly here, not as a place of fixed borders, but as a drifting echo carried by warm winds across fields that once trembled beneath the weight of unspoken truths. In this twilight space, the living and the dead share the same fragile light. The shadows of trees stretch long over soil that has known joy and betrayal in equal measure, and somewhere in that mixture of twilight, air, and half-remembered breath waits a story that disturbed the quiet order of its time. This is not a tale of violence or spectacle, or the kind of drama that courts the loud applause of crowded rooms. No, it is a quieter disruption. The sort that begins with a single life whose existence challenged the heavy certainty of a society unwilling to confront itself. It begins with a name written in calm strokes upon a fragile sheet of paper, a name that should have vanished into the vast silence of vanquished epochs, yet refused to be erased. Amanda America Dickson. Even before we understand the life behind that name, the sound of it holds a delicate tension. It is a name shaped by contradiction, America, as though to claim an entire land that denied her place. Dickson, as though the legacy of a father could fold itself over the life of a child born into an era determined to divide both family and fate. But names rarely tell the whole story. They shimmer only as reflections on the surface of deeper water, hinting at unseen depths. So let us allow the name to rest for a moment like a leaf floating on a slow river, and return instead to the setting in which it first came to rest. Before her birth, before her ascent, before the long shadow of inheritance settled across the South, there were the fields. Endless rows of cotton, moving like pale waves beneath a sky too wide for one human heart to measure. The air here carried the scent of sun-baked earth and the low hum of cicadas, and somewhere beneath that hum lived a rhythm that had defined the region for generations. It was the rhythm of labor unchosen and lives unclaimed. But every era, no matter how rigid or inflexible, conceals within itself a quiet fault line, a place where the ordinary architecture of life can be altered by the slightest shift. It is along this hidden seam of history that the story of Amanda America begins to take shape, not with dramatic thunder nor sudden rupture, but with the hush of twilight falling over a plantation house in Georgia. Imagine for a moment this house not as a monument to wealth or authority, but as a vessel of complicated lives. The wood of its floors had absorbed the footsteps of those who commanded and those who obeyed, those who wrote their names in ledgers and those whose names never entered a single book. In one of its upper rooms, perhaps in the faint afterglow of an early evening, two lives intersected in a way that would ripple outward for decades. An enslaved woman named Julia, young yet already weathered by the invisible burdens of her station, and David Dickson, a man whose life carried the privileges and contradictions of the antebellum South. Out of their union came a child who would one day shake the foundations of the very world that shaped her. But we are not there yet. Before we reach the turmoil in the courtroom and the inheritance that stunned an entire region, we linger here in the twilight. For every life that alters history begins first in silence. There is a stillness in this moment, a stillness that stands at the delicate border between the known and the unknown. Within that stillness, a cradle rests near a window. And outside that window the cotton fields rustle faintly, carrying with them the first breath of a destiny not yet realized. The wind moves gently, as though unwilling to disturb the fragile balance of forces at play. Julia, tender despite all she has endured, leans over the infant whose arrival she could neither prevent nor fully understand. Her thoughts remain unwritten, preserved only in the thin space between what was endured and what was hoped for. It is possible, she sensed even then, that this child would not live a life like the others born in these fields. Perhaps she knew that the world outside this small room would rise to defend its boundaries against anyone who dared to cross them, and yet somehow this tiny life would step across those boundaries with a quiet persistence no one could restrain. In the house below, steps echo faintly, perhaps belonging to those who would look upon the child with curiosity or disapproval. But upstairs in the soft twilight, none of that matters yet. The fragile new life rests in the crook of her mother's arm, unaware of the complicated currents into which she has been delivered. Time has a way of carving its path with slow and patient strokes. It does not rush to reveal meaning. It allows each moment to settle, to deepen, to gather its full weight before letting the next one rise. So let us remain here a little longer, while the night grows denser around the house and the world prepares to change in ways it cannot yet imagine. Amanda, America. The name will one day appear on legal documents and property deeds. It will echo through courtrooms filled with tension and whisper into newspapers carried by trains across the South. But here, in this beginning, it is simply a name uttered in a quiet room, untouched by the storm it will eventually summon. As night descends, the lamps flicker and the first stars begin to pierce the sky, and in the stillness, something else appears. A sheet of paper resting upon a wooden table downstairs. Its edges are neat, its ink dark, its meaning not yet fully formed, but it is there, waiting. A document that will carry the weight of a father's final act and a daughter's abrupt transformation. A page that will outlive the hand that wrote it. We leave our opening moment with that image, not of the child or the fields or the drifting evening light, but of the document resting alone in the quiet house, the ink barely dry, as though holding its breath for the history it is destined to ignite. The document rests in the dim hush of the house, its presence so unassuming that one might mistake it for any ordinary sheet of paper left behind by a distracted hand. Yet there is something in the way it occupies the silence that feels heavier than its delicate form should allow. Something that reaches backward into the fields and forward into the long corridors of time, as though it were a hinge between worlds. That quiet rustle of parchment becomes, in memory, the rustle of cotton fields swaying under the late afternoon wind, and from that sound we return to an earlier moment in the life that began in this house, a moment when the name Amanda America had not yet settled into place, when her small form existed only as a fragile question carried across two worlds that did not wish to acknowledge each other. She was born in 1849, a year like any other in a region that believed itself eternal, a region convinced that its customs were as fixed as the seasons. Yet even then, beneath the polished surfaces of plantation life, subtle tremors stirred. The world that claimed permanence was already beginning to crack. Her birth was not greeted with ceremony or celebration. It arrived like a whisper in a world trained to overlook such whispers, but whispers, when carried far enough by time, become echoes that reshape the air around them. She came into the world as the daughter of Julia, whose name seldom entered written record, and David Dickson, a man whose name appeared everywhere from land deeds to business accounts, a man who understood both the weight and utility of silence. Whether he welcomed the child or simply accepted her as part of the complicated geography of his life remains veiled, for history is often selective in what it chooses to record. But we know she remained close to him, and that proximity would one day alter the expectations of an entire region. In the rising light of her childhood, she was not yet Amanda America. She was simply a girl moving through rooms where she was both part of the household and yet never fully part of its acknowledged story. There is a peculiar tension in such early years, when a child's sense of belonging is shaped not by spoken truths, but by the way adults avert their eyes at certain moments, the tone they use when naming others but not her, the spaces where she is permitted, and the quieter spaces where she is not. Still, she moved through her days with the natural innocence of youth, exploring the edges of her world without yet understanding its invisible borders. Her mother, a presence steady and warm despite the unyielding constraints placed upon her, offered what guidance she could. Julia bore her responsibilities with a quiet dignity, not the dignity others assign, but the kind that grows inwardly from endurance and becomes a form of strength no one can take away. Through her, Amanda first encountered the complex truth of what it meant to exist in a land where a person could be cherished and denied in the same breath. As the girl grew, certain traits began to reveal themselves, subtle signs that the life ahead would not conform to the outlines drawn for her. She was observant in ways that unsettled those who preferred a child to remain unaware. She listened closely, not only to voices but to the spaces between them. The plantation's routines, its unspoken hierarchies, its concealed tensions, all seemed to leave their marks upon her early consciousness. She absorbed them quietly, the way fields absorb the fading light of day, holding its warmth long after sunset. Her father, whether out of affection, obligation, or a complex mixture of both, granted her liberties rarely extended to children born into such circumstances. Yet each allowance was its own paradox, for it placed her both inside and outside the world she inhabited, too privileged to live entirely within her mother's sphere, yet too marked by birth to enter fully into his. She occupied a liminal space that would accompany her throughout her life. This early ambiguity formed the first impression history would later struggle to categorize. The name America, given to her as a child, might have been intended as a gesture of broad possibility, or perhaps a private symbol known only to the man who wrote it. But names, once spoken aloud, escape their original purpose. They take on meanings shaped by the lives that bear them. For Amanda, the name would come to represent the strange intersection where national ideals collided with the lived reality of those excluded from them. In these early years, she learned that her identity was not a single thread, but a knot of contradictions. Born into bondage yet protected by the very man who owned her mother, educated yet confined, a member of the household yet never introduced as such. Her nickname, spoken softly by those who cared for her, held within it a complicated tenderness, a recognition of her uniqueness, but also of the gulf that separated her from a world that could never fully claim her. From the narrow windows of her childhood room, she could see the fields stretching outward in long, pale rows. These fields shaped not only the fortunes of those who owned them but the destinies of those whose labor sustained them. The wind that passed over the cotton carried with it the faint murmurs of countless lives entwined with its growth, and in that whisper lay the early signs of a destiny she could not yet comprehend. She may have observed the way overseers moved with stiff authority, the way workers bent under the sun, the way her mother's hands bore the marks of tasks performed without recognition. All these impressions settled quietly within her, forming the earliest layers of understanding that would accompany her through every stage of her life. The meaning of her name would change over time, shaped by the shifting boundaries of her world, but in these early days, it remained only a soft echo in a house filled with contradictions. It was a name waiting for the world to catch up to the life it foreshadowed. As night descends over this memory, the rustle of the cotton returns, faint but persistent, moving like a question through the darkness. It is the same sound that drifted through the window as she slept in her cradle, the same sound that would follow her through the years like a reminder of the soil from which her story began. It lingers now, carrying us toward the next turn in her journey, where the first true lesson of her life will rise quietly from the shadows, waiting to reveal itself. The rustling of the cotton fields drifts inward like a memory that refuses to fade, and in that persistent whisper we find the young girl standing at the threshold of understanding, not yet aware that the world around her has already begun shaping the first great lesson of her life. The fields she once looked upon with the innocent curiosity of childhood slowly reveal themselves as something more than a landscape. They become a silent teacher, offering truths that no tutor or guardian would speak aloud. From an early age, she sensed that in this place, survival depended on learning to read not only words on a page, but the subtle movements of people, the tones of their voices, the ways their gazes shifted when they spoke of matters they wished to conceal. In the South of her youth, truth was seldom uttered plainly. It lived between lines, beneath gestures, behind doors left half open. Amanda learned this instinctively, absorbing the atmosphere of the house as though it were a second language. She watched the way her father moved through the rooms with a composed certainty born of privilege, while her mother navigated the same spaces with a grace that masked her vigilance. The child stood between these worlds, observing the silent negotiations that played out each day. Her mother rarely explained the unspoken rules directly, but children often learn more from absence than from instruction. When Julia paused before entering a room, or lowered her eyes at a certain moment, or offered a soft reassurance without providing details, Amanda felt the shape of things she did not yet have words for. She sensed that power moved differently for different bodies, that the same house could cradle one person in security and another in fear, that a single sentence could shift tone depending on who spoke it and to whom. This quiet awareness became her earliest form of wisdom. If others saw her as a child sheltered from the harsher realities of the plantation, they were mistaken. She was not untouched by them. She simply understood instinctively that silence could be a kind of armor, a place where knowledge could grow without drawing unwanted eyes. Her first lesson, though unarticulated, emerged from this realization. In a world divided by race, class, and custom, the safest path was often the one walked softly, with careful steps and attentive ears. Through the seasons, she carried this knowledge like a hidden lantern, small yet steady, illuminating corners of her life that might otherwise have remained dark. She began to recognize which conversations ended abruptly when she entered a room, which names were spoken with unease, which decisions stirred tension beneath the surface. She perceived the faint currents of disapproval that followed her presence in certain company, the quick glances exchanged when she stood beside her father, the slight tightening of lips when someone noticed the lightness of her complexion. And she saw something else, too. The quiet sorrow in her mother's eyes when her father showed the girl a kindness not extended to Julia. These small, intricate details pressed themselves into her mind, shaping the contours of her understanding long before she knew their full implications. She learned, without being told, that she must move through the world with a blend of humility and alertness, that she must listen more than she spoke, that she must let others believe she knew less than she did. There are moments in a childhood quiet, almost invisible moments that alter the course of a life not by force, but by recognition. One such moment arrived when Amanda stood in a doorway, half concealed by shadow, watching her father engage with visitors whose manner suggested they believed themselves protectors of a rigid social order. The men spoke with confidence, as though the world were a fixed structure they had built with their own hands, but their voices carried an undercurrent of unease. When they asked about the child her father called his daughter, his reply contained an ambiguity she could not decipher yet felt deeply. She was not mentioned by name. She was referred to in a tone neither affectionate nor dismissive, but cautious. The words were measured, carefully balanced between acknowledgement and concealment. In that moment, the girl understood something essential. She existed within overlapping spheres of identity that others would try to define for her, yet none of those definitions could contain her entirely. The realization did not come with bitterness. It came with clarity. She stepped back from the doorway, her small hand resting against the wooden frame, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingers as though it might anchor her. The room behind her was quiet. The hallway beyond shimmered with the fading light of late afternoon, and for a breathless instant she sensed that she was standing not only at the physical threshold of a room, but at the spiritual threshold of her own becoming. That image of a girl suspended between light and shadow, between belonging and exclusion, between two worlds that claimed her and denied her in different ways, remained with her throughout her life. It became the silent emblem of her early lesson. That she must learn to navigate spaces where no path had been prepared for her, that her strength would come not from confronting the world head-on but from understanding it so deeply that she could move through its complexities without losing herself. The fields outside continued their quiet rustle, as though echoing the lesson she carried within. Their whispering seemed to call her back toward the beginning of all she knew, reminding her that every life is shaped by forces both seen and unseen, spoken and unspoken. And from that gentle but persistent sound, the next stage of her journey rises, carrying her toward the height of a life that would one day place her before a world unprepared for the truth she embodied. The image of the young girl standing at the threshold lingers as the years turn, and in that lingering image the doorway widens until it becomes another threshold entirely, the solemn entrance of a courthouse where the air holds a different weight. A weight shaped by generations of unchallenged order now confronted by a single life whose existence unsettles the careful architecture of the post-war South. The girl who once observed the world from shaded hallways has grown into a woman, quiet in manner yet firm in presence, carrying within her the subtle strength carved from a lifetime of listening, observing, and navigating the invisible lines drawn by others. She arrives not with fanfare but with a calm that unsettles those who expected fear, for calm in such a place is itself a declaration. The moment that will become her summit begins not with argument but with silence, the same silence she once used as shield and refuge, now transformed into a space that forces others to confront her undeniable reality. She stands in a courtroom filled with men whose eyes reflect disbelief, discomfort, and an unease they struggle to hide. These are men who believed they understood the world's hierarchy as surely as they understood the land they claimed as their own, men who thought they knew where every boundary lay. Yet here stands America Dickson, the woman at the center of a will that grants her an inheritance larger than any they imagined a person of her birth could possess, a woman whose very presence upends the certainty to which they cling. The death of her father, David Dickson, had opened the door to this moment. His will, written with deliberate clarity, named her his principal heir, leaving her a vast estate that stretched across Georgia's soil and into the records that carefully preserved the legacies of men, but not of women like her. The will did not whisper. It spoke plainly, as though the man who wrote it knew that only directness could withstand the storm that would follow. Yet even his directness could not quiet the uproar that swept across the region. The courtroom murmurs echo faintly beneath the high ceiling, like the restless stirring of those cotton fields that once taught her the meaning of silence. She stands at the center of a contest, not of her choosing, a contest waged not against her but against the idea of who she is allowed to be. Among the assembled figures are relatives of her father, those whose sense of entitlement rests upon bloodlines recognized only when convenient. Their challenge is not driven by need, but by a refusal to accept the boundary her father crossed when he acknowledged her fully and irrevocably, in the most public way possible, through the written law. As testimony unfolds, as voices rise and arguments accumulate like tidewater against a breakwater, Amanda remains composed. She does not plead for recognition. She does not attempt to persuade. She stands with the stillness of someone who understands that her worth does not depend on the verdict of those before her. The South, still trembling from the end of the Civil War, watches this trial not merely as a legal dispute, but as a confrontation with its own fractured identity. For generations, it had built its social order on rigid categories meant to separate lives like hers from lives like those who now contest her inheritance. Yet here she is, defying every category, presenting a truth the region cannot easily absorb. Her complexion, her education, her manner, each one becomes a point of discomfort for those who wish to deny her claim. But none of these details matter as much as the singular fact that her father saw her not as an unspoken secret, but as his child, deserving of everything he could bestow. The judge listens, the lawyers argue, the spectators murmur, but beneath all the noise lies the quiet truth of her existence, a truth that requires no embellishment. She stands as the living embodiment of the contradictions that shaped her birthplace. The moment of judgment arrives with the slow, deliberate finality of a stone settling into riverbed. The ruling upholds the will. The inheritance is hers. And with that ruling, the world shifts, not with the violence of upheaval but with the deep, structural tremor that comes when long-held certainties are forced to accommodate a new reality. In that moment, America Dickson becomes one of the wealthiest black women in the South, though she does not frame her life in terms of wealth. For her, the ruling is not a triumph but an acknowledgement, a recognition of the truth she had carried quietly since childhood. Yet even as the ruling settles over the room, a question moves through the air like a draft, subtle yet undeniable, a question whispered not by any one voice, but by the collective disquiet of those who cannot reconcile the verdict with their vision of the world. What does wealth mean in a land still haunted by chains? The question hangs there, suspended in the hush that follows the judge's words, drifting through the courtroom like dust caught in a narrow beam of light. It does not demand an answer. It waits, patient as time itself, knowing that the meaning it seeks cannot be offered in a single moment. And as the people in the room shift uncertainly, as the weight of the decision settles into their understanding, the question lingers, guiding us toward the next symbol that will take shape in her story, waiting quietly for the moment when ink and intention intertwine to reveal the deeper truth behind the will that altered everything. The question drifts through the air long after the courtroom empties, its echo lingering like the fading warmth of a lamp just extinguished. And as it settles into silence, it leads us back to the room where her father once sat in the quiet hours before dawn, his pen moving slowly across a sheet of parchment that would become the most symbolic artifact of her life. The gesture itself was unremarkable in appearance, a simple act repeated countless times by men of his status, yet in this instance, the motion of pen against paper carried the weight of a private reckoning. David Dickson, a man molded by the contradictions of his era, wrote with a deliberateness that suggested he understood the storm his decision would summon. His hand did not tremble, but there was a gravity to each stroke, as though he were not simply naming an error but attempting to correct, in a single document, a lifetime of boundaries drawn by society and circumstance. The will, when completed, became more than a legal instrument. It became the symbol at the heart of Amanda's story, an object that lived at the crossroads of paternal acknowledgement and societal defiance. It held a meaning far deeper than the wealth it transferred. It embodied a truth that had existed quietly within the walls of the house, but had never been spoken aloud in the language of law, that he saw her not as a shadowed presence on the edges of his life, but as the rightful continuation of his legacy. When Amanda later held the document in her hands, she did so with a stillness that mirrored her father's handwriting, a stillness that seemed almost reverent. The parchment was smooth but carried the faint texture of time, the ink bold yet softened at the edges where the quill had lingered. She traced the lines slowly, not as one who marvels at a sudden rise in fortune, but as someone absorbing the depth of a gesture she had long sensed but never fully known. The symbol did not lie in the wealth or property or authority it conveyed. Those were mere extensions of the larger truth captured in the strokes of a pen. The symbol lay in the acknowledgement itself, the moment when a boundary that had defined her life was quietly erased by the man who had both shaped and constrained her existence. Yet symbols rarely rest peacefully in the world. They stir those who would prefer the past remain unaltered. They call forth the discomfort of recognition. In this case, the will became a mirror, and the South, already in the fragile years following the war, was forced to confront its own reflection. The symbol carried implications far beyond the Dickson family. It suggested that the rigid hierarchies upon which the region had built its identity were neither eternal nor absolute. It revealed a truth many wished to avoid, that lineage, blood, inheritance, and belonging could not always be confined within the boundaries society claimed to uphold. The ink on the parchment did not merely name her the beneficiary. It named her as part of a narrative the region had long denied existed. In the quiet moments after the courtroom ruling, she would hold the document again, feeling its weight differently now, as though it were no longer simply a gesture of recognition, but a testament to her own endurance. She did not celebrate. Celebration was not her nature. Instead, she allowed the significance to settle slowly into her consciousness, like the evening light that filters gently through a room without drawing attention to itself. The will became an anchor, a symbolic core around which her life continued to unfold. It reminded her of the distance she had traveled from the child in the cradle near the window to the woman now standing at the center of a legal storm. It reminded her of her mother, whose presence lingered in her memory as both solace and compass. It reminded her of the years spent observing, listening, and learning to navigate the fragile terrain of a world that had no easy place for her. Yet even as she absorbed its meaning, the will remained unfinished in one sense. Symbols, after all, gain power through interpretation, and the South interpreted this one with a mixture of disbelief, resentment, curiosity, and quiet awe. Some saw it as an act of justice. Others saw it as betrayal. Still others tried to reduce it to anomaly, insisting that such exceptions did not threaten the larger system. But symbols are patient. They do not need sudden upheaval to alter history. They simply need to exist, to persist, to remain visible long enough for their meaning to deepen. And as the ink settled into the parchment, its edges darkening slightly with time, it became not only the symbol of a father's final affirmation, but also a subtle invitation for those who lived in the shadow of rigid borders to imagine a world where those borders might one day be redrawn. In the dim quiet of her home, the document sometimes lay upon a table, as it had on the night it was first written, catching the faint glow of lamplight, the ink shimmering like a memory rising from deep within the paper. And as we follow that image, the spreading ink becomes something else entirely, widening into the branching pathways of her life, guiding us toward the stages through which she would move with quiet resilience, each phase carrying the imprint of this central symbol that the world had tried, but failed, to deny. The ink that once rested so deliberately on parchment begins to widen in our imagination, spreading outward like the slow unfurling of a map, its lines extending into the winding pathways of her life as it moved through time with a rhythm both gentle and unyielding. From these expanding lines arise the stages through which Amanda America passed, each phase shaped by the contradictions she inherited, the choices she made, and the limits the world imposed upon her even as it struggled to understand the life she represented. Youth gave way to early adulthood, with the subtlety of dusk merging into evening, the boundaries between the two not marked by any single moment but by a gradual deepening of awareness. She continued her education with care, guided by tutors who recognized her aptitude yet rarely acknowledged the complexity of her identity. Learning became not only an exercise of the mind but a refuge, a space where the rigid structures of society loosened their grip. In books, she found a quiet terrain where thought could roam freely, unburdened by the expectations placed upon her because of her birth. Knowledge did not erase the tensions that shaped her world, but it helped her understand them in ways that gave her inner stability. As she moved into adulthood, the world beyond the plantation gathered around her with a mixture of curiosity and guarded respect. She carried herself with an ease that unsettled those who tried to situate her within familiar categories. Her manner was calm, deliberate, and perceptive. She did not seek the attention her inheritance invited, nor did she use her status to assert dominance. Instead, she lived within the contours of her own quiet dignity, guided more by inward principle than outward ambition. Marriage came as another step in the unfolding map of her life, though not with the romantic flourish that stories often assign to such moments. Her first marriage was brief, shadowed by incompatibilities that revealed themselves early. Her husband died soon after, leaving behind more questions than memories, and once again she found herself navigating the delicate terrain between sorrow and independence. It was not in her nature to cling to grief, yet she respected its presence, allowing it to move through her life with the same gentle melancholy that shaped so much of her inner world. Motherhood entered her life with deeper resonance. Her children became anchors in a landscape that often felt uncertain, offering her both a sense of continuity and a responsibility that transcended the complexities of her own origins. She raised them with a steadiness that echoed the strength of her mother, preserving for them the inner calm she had cultivated across years of quiet observation. They grew beneath the shelter of her presence, learning from her the value of restraint, patience, and thoughtful silence. Still, the world beyond her home remained fraught with tension. Though her inheritance granted her financial security, it did not shield her from the subtle and persistent prejudices that lingered in the post-war South. Whispers followed her, not always hostile but rarely comfortable, as though her life were a question others hesitated to confront directly. She felt these shifts in tone, in posture, in the softness of greetings that held a trace of distance. Yet she responded not with resistance, but with the same composed endurance that had guided her since childhood. As years passed, she relocated from rural Hancock County to Augusta, seeking an environment that offered a gentler rhythm. The move marked another transition, one shaped less by necessity than by a desire for space that could hold her life without constant scrutiny. In Augusta, she built a home of quiet refinement, its rooms arranged with thoughtful care, its windows opening onto a world she could observe without being endlessly observed herself. But time, ever faithful to its steady forward pull, introduced change with the slow inevitability of seasons shifting. Her health, once steady, began to falter. The vigor of youth softened into the stillness of middle age, and the stillness deepened into the early signs of decline. She felt the narrowing of her days, not with fear but with a serene melancholy, as though she were watching a long twilight stretch across the horizon. Yet even in decline, she did not retreat into bitterness or regret. Life had given her moments of contradiction, clarity, loss, and grace, each one contributing to the quiet resonance she carried within. She had lived neither loudly nor invisibly, but somewhere in the space between, where dignity becomes its own form of resistance. As dusk settles around her memory, she stands by a window in the home she made in Augusta, looking out toward the softening line of the evening sky. The world beyond the glass shifts gently beneath the fading light, and she remains still, her thoughts neither troubled nor triumphant, simply present. It is here, in this unassuming moment, that the stages of her life coalesce into something whole, each phase carrying the imprint of the symbols, lessons, and quiet reckonings that shaped her journey. Outside, the day exhales, and a single breath of wind stirs the edges of the curtain, an unresolved whisper leading us toward the deeper philosophy that guided her and the guardian figure whose presence, though softened by time, never faded from the compass of her inner life. The faint movement of the curtain, stirred by the soft breath of evening wind, becomes the threshold through which we enter the inner chambers of her philosophy, the quiet architecture of belief that shaped her life long before she could name it. In the stillness of that dim room, where day fades into a contemplative hush, her thoughts gather like gentle currents moving beneath the surface of a wide and undisturbed river. For America Dickson, philosophy was never a matter of grand declarations or written treatises. It emerged instead from the ordinary rhythms of endurance, from the silent ways she learned to carry herself through a world that offered her both privilege and exclusion. Her understanding of life was formed not through confrontation, but through observation, through the steady awareness that every person, no matter their station, moved within the confines of unseen fears and unspoken desires. She cultivated a way of being that resembled the slow unfurling of light across a quiet morning. Restraint became a form of wisdom, dignity became her shield, and silence, the same silence that had protected her as a child, matured into a philosophy of its own. She understood that words, once spoken, create obligations, rifts, and expectations. Silence, by contrast, held space. It allowed understanding to deepen without conflict. It allowed wounds to heal with gentleness rather than strain. Yet her silence was never submission. It was the stillness of someone who had learned to see beneath surfaces. She recognized the fragile pride behind hostility, the shaky foundations beneath certainty, the loneliness behind authority. Her manner was soft, but her perception was clear. She knew when to speak and when to let a moment pass untouched. Behind this guiding philosophy stood a single figure whose presence lingered long after her own life had changed beyond recognition. Her mother, Julia, remained the guardian of her earliest understanding, the quiet source from which her moral compass drew its strength. Though the world rarely recorded Julia's voice, it remained alive in her daughter's memory, not as a collection of spoken lessons but as a steady influence woven into the fabric of her being. Julia had moved through her own life within the narrow boundaries imposed upon her, yet there was a grandeur in her endurance, a steadfast grace that refused to be broken by circumstance. Amanda had watched her mother navigate impossible terrain with a serenity that defied despair. There were moments, in that childhood home, when Amanda would awaken in the night and hear her mother's footsteps moving softly through the room, checking on her with a tenderness that contrasted starkly with the harshness of the world outside those walls. It was not the footsteps themselves that shaped her philosophy, but the gentleness within them, the reassurance carried in simple gestures that asked for nothing in return. In later years, long after her mother had passed, Amanda would think of those nights when the lamp glowed faintly near her bedside, and Julia's presence seemed to hover in the warm stillness. She came to understand that her mother had been both shield and teacher, not through instruction but through example. From her, Amanda learned that strength could exist quietly, without the need for recognition. That grace could be an act of defiance. That dignity, when held firmly, could reshape the boundaries others sought to impose. As she matured, these principles deepened into a worldview rooted in patience and reflection. She did not seek to change society, nor to challenge its structures directly. Her life was not a public battle but a private journey toward understanding the meaning of her existence within a fragmented world, yet her very way of living exerted its own quiet influence. By embodying a kind of serenity that defied the expectations placed upon her, she revealed the possibility of another way of being, one that neither mirrored the bitterness of injustice nor retreated from the complexity of truth. In conversations with those closest to her, she spoke softly, offering insights that felt less like advice and more like gentle interpretations of life's shifting landscape. She believed that each person carried their own fractured history within them, and that the work of living was not to escape these fractures, but to find coherence within them. She believed in patience, not as resignation but as a way of allowing life to reveal itself at the pace it required. And she believed in gratitude, not the shallow gratitude urged upon those asked to accept less than they deserved, but the deeper kind that arises from recognizing the beauty that persists despite hardship. In her final years, as her strength waned and the horizon of her life grew narrower, she kept near her a small Bible, its pages worn by handling rather than fervent reading. It was less a book of doctrine for her than a companion, a vessel of quiet familiarity. Sometimes she would rest her hand gently upon it, not seeking answers but acknowledging the presence of something larger than her own existence. It was in this gesture, simple, unmomentous, that her entire philosophy seemed to reside. The quiet hand placed upon a book she neither exalted nor dismissed, a gesture of humility and grounding, a connection to the unseen currents that shape the lives of all who move through this world with uncertain steps. And as her hand rests there in memory, the room illuminated by a lamp that casts a soft golden arc across the pages, we begin to feel the final shift in the story, the movement toward the edge where life meets its last threshold. The same stillness that guided her through childhood now gathers around her adulthood, preparing her for a moment that approaches without haste, carrying with it the gentle inevitability of nightfall. The hand resting upon the worn Bible remains still, as though listening to the quiet within the room, and from that stillness the final chapter of her life begins to take shape with the soft and unhurried gravity that accompanies every true ending. The house in Augusta holds its breath around her, the walls absorbing the muted sounds of a fading day, the lamp casting a steady glow that touches her features with the gentlest outline of light. She has grown accustomed to the ebb and flow of her own strength, aware that each passing season has drawn her closer to the narrowing edge, where life begins its gradual retreat into memory. Yet there is no fear in her expression, no tension in the slowing rhythm of her breath. Her life, which began in contradiction and unfolded through quiet perseverance, now approaches its conclusion with the same inward dignity that guided her through all the years between. She was 43 when her body began to falter in ways that could not be explained by simple fatigue. Illness crept into her days with a soft persistence, Not enough to alarm those around her at first, but enough to make her pause more often, enough to darken the edges of her vision when she moved too quickly. The physicians offered their interpretations, each more uncertain than the last, yet none of their explanations mattered as much as the feeling she carried within her, the sense that her time in this world was beginning to contract like a final breath drawn slowly into the chest of dusk. In these final weeks she spent her days in reflection rather than regret. Her children visited often, their voices bringing warmth to the quiet rooms, their presence reminding her that life continues its unfolding even as one thread begins to loosen. She offered them no grand speeches or solemn warnings. She believed such things belonged to stories crafted for effect, not to the gentle realities of a family facing its own transitions. Instead, she gave them her presence, her listening, her calm. She wanted them to feel that endings need not be harsh, that departure could be as tender as arrival if met with acceptance rather than fear. As her strength waned, she found herself returning often to the window that overlooked the soft incline of the yard. The world beyond it moved with the muted rhythm of late afternoon, the branches shifting slightly in the breeze, the light warm but subdued. She would sit in her chair, the Bible resting lightly on her lap, and gaze into that quiet landscape as though it held the final pages of her own story. The deep melancholy she felt was not sorrow but a kind of recognition, the understanding that a life lived between worlds must inevitably leave them both with the same quiet grace with which it traveled through them. Her mind drifted often to her mother, Julia, whose presence she felt more strongly in her final days than she had in years. It was not a haunting but a comfort, as though the thread that had first guided her into this life was preparing to guide her out of it. She remembered the sound of her mother's voice, low and steady, the cadence of her steps in the early morning when the household was still asleep. She remembered the warmth of her hand, the softness of her gaze, the strength of her silence, and she felt, deep within, that this return to memory was not an escape but a completion. On a day that unfolded with the same slow gentleness as the many that had come before, she sensed the final shift within her body. Her breath grew more delicate, more measured, like the narrowing of a path that leads toward a distant place no longer visible yet fully felt. She asked for no witnesses, no rituals, no last attempts to postpone the inevitable. She simply allowed herself to recline, the lamplight flickering softly across the room, the window open just enough to let the night air drift in. In that moment, the world around her seemed to pause. The quiet held its shape. Her eyes, which had always carried the calm of someone who understood the complexity of being seen and unseen, grew still, and with a final breath, unstrained, unhurried, she stepped beyond the threshold that had always waited patiently for her. Her last word, if one can call it that, was not a sound but a presence. It lived in the serenity of her departure, in the absence of struggle, in the gentleness with which she allowed herself to slip from the world. It was the final expression of the philosophy she had carried through life, that there is dignity in quiet endings, and that the deepest truths often make themselves known not through proclamation, but through the calm surrender to what must come. After her passing, the house remained still, holding the imprint of her presence like a faint warmth lingering in the air long after a candle has been extinguished. The lamp beside her continued to burn, casting circles of soft light across the room, touching the edges of the Bible she had held moments before. Outside the window, the night deepened, its vast and gentle darkness gathering around the home that had sheltered her final days. The curtains stirred once more, moved by a breeze that seemed to carry something away, something neither visible nor measurable, yet unmistakably felt. And in that quiet, the last word of her life unspoken, unresolved, serene drifted into the night, preparing the way for the legacy that would continue long after her presence had dissolved into memory. The night outside the open window deepens into a quiet vastness, a darkness neither heavy nor foreboding but soft, expansive, and patient, as though the world itself has paused to absorb the absence left behind by her departing breath. The lamp still burns in the room where she has passed, its warm circle of light gathering around the chair, the folded blanket, the faint impression of her hand upon the worn Bible. Yet while the house remains unchanged in its form, something within it has shifted irrevocably. A life built on quiet endurance and gentle strength has withdrawn, leaving behind not emptiness, but a resonant stillness, like the final vibration of a struck bell fading slowly into silence. It is from this open window, this threshold where the interior world meets the night beyond, that her legacy begins its long and steady unfolding. Legacies rarely start with ceremony. They begin in the quiet after a life has ended, when those who remain attempt to gather meaning from the fragments left behind. In Amanda's case, the meaning does not lie solely in the wealth she possessed or the home she created. It lies in the way her existence pushed against the boundaries of a region that struggled to understand her, in the way her life revealed truths that had been carefully hidden beneath the surface of Southern society. The legal battle that once placed her at the center of public scrutiny did not fade with the passing of years. Instead, it became a reference point in discussions of inheritance, legitimacy, and racial identity, a case studied not for its spectacle, but for its demonstration of a simple fact, that the South's long-held structures could be questioned not only through rebellion or protest, but through the quiet assertion of a life that refused to fit the contours assigned to it. Her story reappeared in journals and legal texts, resurfacing at intervals like a recurring tide, each generation finding in her life a new interpretation, a reflection of its own questions about the meaning of family, identity, and justice. Some saw her as an anomaly, a singular figure whose circumstances could not easily be replicated. Others recognized her as a symbol of a deeper fissure in the social foundation of her time, a reminder that the complexities of human relationships often defy the rigid categories imposed by law and custom. But beyond legal debate and historical discourse, her legacy lived more quietly, carried forward by the memories of those who had known her. They spoke of her gentleness, her composure, the way she entered a room without demanding space, yet somehow shaped the atmosphere with her presence. They remembered the subtle way she listened, not with the intent to respond, but with the desire to understand. And they recalled the serenity that seemed to accompany her, a serenity rooted not in ease, but in the lifelong practice of navigating a world that was never entirely prepared for her existence. With time, the meaning of her life stretched beyond the particulars of her circumstances. She came to represent a form of resilience distinct from defiance, a resilience built from quiet self-possession, a refusal to let the world determine the worth of her being. In the decades that followed her passing, as the South continued its slow, uneven transformation, her name surfaced again and again as a touchstone for discussions about inheritance laws, racial identity, and the complexities of family history. It appeared in lectures, articles, and genealogical studies, not as a sensational figure but as an enigmatic presence, a reminder of the quiet lives that alter history not through grand action, but through their unyielding truth. Yet her legacy does not belong solely to law or history. It lives also in the intimate spaces of personal reflection, where her story calls forth a deeper contemplation of what it means to belong, to be acknowledged, to exist at the intersection of identities the world often prefers to separate. Her life invites us to consider the boundaries that persist in our own time, the ways in which society continues to struggle with the complexities of lineage, origin, and recognition. She becomes not a figure of triumph or tragedy, but a mirror held up to the human condition, reflecting the quiet strength that resides in all who must navigate worlds that do not fully see them. As we return to the open window through which her final breath slipped into the night, we hear a faint sound, a page turning somewhere in the darkness, the soft whir of paper shifting in a room that might be distant or close or entirely imagined. It is the sound of her story continuing its motion through time, carried forward by those who seek to understand the truth of forgotten lives. The page turns not with urgency but with the same calm cadence that shaped her life, inviting us to listen more deeply, to look more gently, to remember that history is not composed solely of the loudest voices, but also of the quiet ones whose presence lingers long after they have left the world. And so her legacy endures, not as an emblem of conflict but as a quiet illumination, a faint but steady light moving across generations, reminding us that the lives shaped by silence often reveal the most profound truths when we choose to hear them. In that soft turning of the unseen page, her story opens once more, inviting us to hold it with the same care she carried through every stage of her being, a final echo lingering in the twilight of forgotten lives. Just tell me, continue with an epilogue, or begin a new story, or revise this into, I am ready whenever you are. The page that turned in the darkness settles once more into silence, yet silence is never truly still. It carries with it the faint residue of movement, the suggestion that another chapter waits just beyond the edge of what has been told, not as part of the structure we have completed but as a soft afterglow, an echo that lingers because the life we have followed refuses to conclude entirely. So let us remain here a moment longer, not to add to the story but to inhabit its reverberation, to breathe in the quiet that surrounds the legacy of a woman whose existence illuminated the hidden contours of her time. History often ends its accounts abruptly, drawing neat lines at the moment of a life's departure, yet real stories resist such endings. They continue to drift through the years, carried in the gestures of descendants, in the records preserved in courthouse drawers, in the faint tremble of recognition that arises when someone encounters a name once spoken gently in rooms now lost to dust. Amanda's name, soft yet enduring, moves through time like a low current in a deep river, shifting quietly but with persistence. It settles in archives where scholars trace the fine threads of the past. It rests in legal texts, where her inheritance case remains a point of reference for questions of legitimacy and identity. It appears in genealogical searches when families look for missing branches in their histories, discovering in her story a reminder that lineage is never as simple as we imagine. And beyond these formal traces, her presence endures in the imaginations of those who lean into forgotten histories, drawn not by spectacle but by the subtle power of lives lived in the spaces between categories. For in the end, what makes her story remarkable is not the fortune she received or the challenge she represented to the social order of her time. It is the way she lived with a stillness that absorbed the contradictions around her without allowing them to fracture her inwardly. She moved through her world not with defiance but with an intimate understanding of its delicate fractures, carrying herself as though guided by an unseen thread that connected the quiet past to the mysterious future. In this lingering moment, after the story's final chapter, we feel that thread extend toward us. It reminds us that history is not a series of resolved events but a living field of echoes, shaped by the lives of those who rarely appear in textbooks, yet shaped the world in ways that reverberate softly across generations. Amanda's life is one such echo. It whispers of resilience rooted not in resistance but in presence. It tells of inheritance not merely of wealth but of truth, a truth written in the fragile ink of one man's recognition and carried forward in the calm dignity of the woman who received it. And as we listen to that whisper, we recognize something else, that the twilight we entered at the beginning of this journey has not fully lifted. It remains around us, a place where memory and imagination meet, where forgotten lives rise gently into view, inviting us to consider how many such stories lie just beyond the reach of our everyday awareness. The lamp in her room has long since burned out. The window is closed. The night that received her final breath has drifted into countless mornings and evenings, each one carrying faint remnants of the life that once moved through those walls. Yet the echo remains, not loud, not insistent, but steady, like the low hum of wind passing through tall grass, or the soft rustling of cotton fields beneath a sky that holds every era at once. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. A quiet reminder that even the most unassuming life can alter the shape of history, not through force or fame, but through the subtle gravity of being exactly what the world did not expect, yet quietly needed. And so we leave her story here, in the twilight where we first entered, not extinguished but gently glowing, a small, steady light fading into the vastness of time, inviting us to remember that in the quietest corners of history lie the truths that illuminate us most.